Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Idaho Falls. So glad you could join us this morning on this lovely spring morning. My name's Vic Allen. I'll be the worship associate today. We have a couple of announcements before we get started with our regular service this morning, or at least one announcement. The Unitarian Universalist Association Lifespan Faith Engagement Office has notified the Unitarian Universalist Church in Idaho Falls that Elizabeth Coliati has received a Renaissance recognition for achieving 75 hours of Renaissance training. We'd like to congratulate Elizabeth for this achievement and thank her for her commitment to continuing education in religious education and leadership. The adult classes run by Elizabeth Coliati are scheduled and starting soon. One of them starts this afternoon. There is room for a few more participants. You can email Elizabeth. You can find her email on the website. If you've got a pencil handy, it's dree@idahofallsuu.org, and she'll send you a Zoom link for that class. What Moves Us on UU Beliefs will begin this afternoon at 2 p.m., and Building the World We Dream About on Anti-Racism will begin Tuesday, April 20th at 7 p.m. Please join us now for our prelude, The Earth is Our Mother, which is attributed to the Hopi tribe of Northern California and performed by the UU Fellowship in Franklin, North Carolina.
The earth is our mother, we must take care of her. The earth is our mother, we must take care of her. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Her sacred ground we walk upon, with every step we take. Her sacred ground we walk upon, with every step we take. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. The earth is our mother, she will take care of us. The earth is our mother, she will take care of us. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. The sky is our father, we will take care of him. The sky is our father, we will take care of him. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. The sea is our sister, we will take care of her. The sea is our sister, we will take care of her. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. The forest is our brother, we will take care of him. The forest is our brother, we will take care of him. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan.
Now I'd like you to take a deep breath and let it out. As you become aware of your posture, straighten your spine so that you feel alert but not rigid. Take slow, deep breaths. Then settle into a relaxed focus as you follow the sensations of each inhale and exhale. Please join me now in our covenant. Love is the spirit of this community, in service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This morning, our chalice lighting comes from Gordon B. McKinnon. Let there be light. Let it shine in dark places, in moments of pain, in times of grief, in the darkness of hatred, violence, and oppression, where there is discouragement and despair. Wherever darkness is to be put to flight, let there be light.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning is the poem Gray Wolf by O. Fred Donaldson. Gray Wolf, we are sending you to that great God. Tell him that we who invented forgiveness do not forgive, that we who speak of trust cannot trust, that we who invoke faith would not believe. I read as though you could read, but I know you understand. When you have left the forest and tundras and no longer leave your sinewy trails within the snows, tell him that you were made on a different day. Your howls of bewilderment will echo with the mountain winds, and your songs will join those of the whales. Tell him for me, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. I invite you to join in our opening hymn this morning, number 163, For the Earth Forever Turning.
Today's Time for All Ages is Tondeka's Change of Heart by Tondeka, read by Elizabeth Coyote, Director of Lifespan Faith Development. This story is from the curriculum What Moves Us. If you like this story, we start these workshops this afternoon at 2 p.m. on Zoom. Email dree@idahofallsuu.org for the link. Tondeka's Change of Heart. In July 2003, I went on an 8-day spiritual retreat at a Benedictine monastery in Wisconsin. The night before I left Chicago to drive to the monastery, as preparation for the journey, I made a series of decisions about what kind of clothes I would need while on this retreat. I was thorough. I thought about the weather conditions in Chicago. The past few days had been quite hot. I looked up the weather conditions in the city closest to the monastery. The temperature there had also been quite warm for several days. As part of this prep work, I remembered that the weather in Wisconsin was often colder than the weather in Chicago. I knew this fact because I had gone on a college retreat 30 years ago to a campsite in northern Wisconsin in the dead of winter and had not taken adequate clothing, so I had been cold for 3 days. Not wanting to repeat this clothing disaster of 30 years ago, I decided to prepare for the worst, just in case the hot July summer weather suddenly turned unseasonably cold. So I packed a heavy winter coat, 2 heavy sweatshirts, a turtleneck sweater, a Polartec hat, Polartec mittens, and a heavy scarf. I also decided to take a blanket with me just in case my room at the monastery became uncomfortably cold because the heating system might not be turned on in July. When I arrived at the monastery, I schlepped all of this stuff up 2 flights of stairs, neatly folded all of the winter items, placed them in the storage space facing my bed, and left them there untouched for 8 days because the temperature never fell below 75 degrees. I had done this before. I travel a lot in order to lead workshops, present sermons, and read papers on my theological work. So it is not unusual for me to spend 2 or 3 weekends a month on the road, and yet more often than not, I have tended to take the wrong clothes with me on my travels. As a result, I have often felt ill at ease in my body while I led workshops on spiritual practices intended to help others feel more at ease in their bodies. As I sat in my monastery in July looking at my winter clothes, I sensed that if I could figure out why I had such a difficult time thinking about my body, I might discover something new about me. Why couldn't I make realistic decisions about my own body's future physical needs? The Wisconsin retreat seemed like the perfect place to answer this question. So everything I did while on my retreat was framed by this question. Thus, when I read a story in the contemporary neurologist Antonio Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, Emotion, Reason, and the Human Brain, about a man who thought about himself as if he had a body, I had an aha moment. The story that galvanized my attention was about a man who had suffered injury to the prefrontal lobe of his brain, which made it impossible for him to do anything internally with his body except think about it. He could not think within it or through it. He was unaware of the emotional feelings linked to his thoughts and sensations. I knew that I no longer wanted to be an as-if thinker and vowed to start thinking with my body again. But how could I achieve this end? How could I think my way back into my own body's feelings, my own emotions? How could I keep my mind focused on my own body's emotional feelings and sentiments? Clearly, it was time for me to experiment. I had brought a small paperweight with me on the retreat, so I decided to start carrying it around in my pocket during the day and to keep it in hand at night. This way, I reasoned, my mind would be aware of something different about my body, and would thus be forced to stay focused on actual feelings within my body instead of taking flights of fancy into interesting or important ideas. The first day was rather heady. I smiled to myself at my silly game as I carried the paperweight with me all day. Perhaps I did not suffer from a prefrontal brain injury, I thought, but I might nevertheless be addled. But I was on retreat and gave myself permission to persist with this silly game. And so I arrived at the first night of this experiment. I climbed into my small monastery bed in my small monastery room with my paperweight in hand. I decided that if I awakened during the night, as I sometimes do, I would make my mind sink into the feeling of the weight in my hand. And so when I awoke, I held on to the paperweight. I directed all of the attention to the feelings and sensations entailed in holding a 6-ounce weight in my hand. I did this for about an hour until I fell into sleep, still focusing on the feelings of the extra weight in my hand. In the morning, I awoke with a profound sense of a physical sadness that I had not known before. I was not depressed. I did not feel shame or guilt. I simply felt inexplicably sad. Could it be, I now wondered, that I have such a difficult time thinking with my body about my body because it is so sad? Extravagant eating, drinking, shopping, gallivanting, even reading had dulled my awareness of this pervasive feeling in me for years. These practices had dulled my awareness of me. I resolved to hold on to the emotional sadness I now felt. I stayed in this sea of sadness night and day. I was now in a state of mourning, letting go of what I had already lost, an internal sense of community. Until now, I had held on to that lost sense of community as if real community were present in my home. My mind now understood my body's sadness. At home, I had felt abandoned and alone, but without emotionally acknowledging it. I, the mind, was a head trip of a body at sea. Gradually, I began to notice a shift, a letting go, a change of heart. It was subtle. The shift was so subtle that I can only describe it by referring to an extreme example of it, a story recounted by psychoanalytic R.D. Laing during his work with a catastrophic schizophrenic. Each day as Lang made his rounds, he would sit next to the immobile man and say something like this: "If my mother had locked me in a closet for all of those years, I wouldn't want to talk to anyone either." Day in and day out, year after year, Lang made such statements to the man, and he would move on to his next patient. And then the day came. Lang sat next to the man, told him he would not want to speak to another either if he had been treated the way this man had been treated by his mother, and the man turned to him and said, "Yeah." The shift I felt within myself was not this dramatic, and yet, for me, it was as vividly affirming. I had finally said to myself, "I am sad, and for good reason," and I heard myself reply, "Yeah." Suddenly, I felt a childlike intensity of feeling that turns my every experience of life into something unmistakably marvelous. I felt love beyond belief, and I loved life, every moment of it. But I could not sustain this change of heart by myself. I needed the care and compassion of my own Unitarian Universalist community to stay the spiritual course of my change of heart, that my experience of love beyond belief. The end.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We've reached that point in our service where the members and visitors and friends of our congregation share joys and concerns. And as I express these joys and concerns, as they've been shared with us, Reverend Kevin will light a candle for each joy and concern. Our first is from Lisa Christensen, who tells us, "My daughter Sophie did not have COVID. She is recovered, she's feeling fine, and she's back to work, and more importantly, climbing." From Victoria this morning, Victoria McDonald, we have a concern for congregation members who are suffering from physical or mental pain. Our thoughts and prayers go out to you, and we are here to support you any and every way we can. And also a joy from Victoria this morning, the joy of the lovely weather we've had in the last 4 days, and anticipating a few more days of that lovely weather. The plants, Victoria tells us, are as joyful as the humans. And we'll light one more candle for those joys or concerns that remain in our hearts and we are not yet quite ready to share.
Our reading this morning comes from the book Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone. Whatever situation we are in, we can choose our response. When facing overwhelming challenges, we might feel that our actions don't count for much, yet the kind of responses we make and the degree to which we believe they count are shaped by the way we think and feel about hope. Here's an example. Jane cared deeply about the world and was horrified by what she saw happening. She regarded human beings as a lost cause, as so stuck in our destructive ways that she saw the complete wrecking of our world as inevitable. What's the point of doing anything if it won't change what we're heading for, she asked. The word hope has two different meanings. The first involves hopefulness, where our preferred outcome seems reasonably likely to happen. If we require this kind of hope before we commit ourselves to an action, our response gets blocked in areas where we don't rate our chances too high. This is what happened for Jane. She felt so hopeless, she didn't see the point of even trying to do anything. The second meaning is about desire. When Jane was asked what she'd like to have happen in the world, without hesitation, she described the future she hoped for, the kind of world she longed for so much it hurt. It is this kind of hope that starts our journey, knowing what we hope for and what we'd like or love to take place. It is what we do with this hope that really makes the difference. Passive hope is about waiting for external agencies to bring about what we desire. Active hope is about becoming active participants in bringing about what we hope for. This week, on April 22nd, the world will celebrate Earth Day. It is the 51st anniversary of the first Earth Day event in 1970 that many consider to be the real beginning of the modern environmental movement. As always, caring for the earth will be the focus of workshops, rallies, and even worship services all week, covering topics from pollution to climate change and mass extinctions, the environmental impacts on indigenous people and people of color, wilderness preservation and the inherent rights of nature, and so many other issues that are often intersectional and intertwined. Just staying informed about the overwhelming variety of issues the planet faces can be enough to send someone into a well of despair, let alone trying to do something about them. Even prioritizing a single issue like climate change as the target of one's activism presents challenges that can seem overwhelming. How do we bring about, for example, the kind of wholesale reduction in carbon emissions that requires unprecedented cooperation on a global scale, when tribalism and human avarice are as prevalent as ever? And here in the United States, unlike in most of the world, how do we begin to address a problem that so many of our neighbors deny as even having a reality? For those of us who care about such things, it is tempting sometimes to just sit down and weep. Perhaps there is some comfort, at least, in knowing we are not alone in our concerns or in our grief. In a 2018 Yale study, for example, 62% of people surveyed felt at least somewhat concerned about climate change, up from 49% in 2010. Unable to remain emotionally distant from the reality, a growing number of people are becoming affected by a collective climate grief that is sweeping through society as climate change becomes less abstract and more apparent. Increased anxiety and depression about the present and future threats of climate change are beginning to impact people of all ages and demographics. Children are becoming terrified about what they see in the news, and young couples are reluctant to bring children into a world in crisis. This is supported by a 2017 report from the American Psychological Association about the traumatic impact of climate change that noted gradual long-term changes in climate can also surface a number of different emotions, including fear, anger, feelings of powerlessness, or exhaustion. It is apparent that extreme weather events and dire warnings about other impacts of climate change are taking a psychological as well as a physical toll on many people. And for now, it is likely that this will only get worse. And let us not forget the other ecological issues that have been a source of grief, some for even long before we became aware of the threat of climate change. Over the last couple of centuries, the detrimental impact of human beings on the earth has become evident to many naturalists and philosophers, as well as ordinary folks around the globe. Overhunting, pollution, and habitat loss have caused the extinction of far too many species, from the passenger pigeon to the Tasmanian tiger. And though most people remained blissfully unaware and unaffected, those who had closer relationships with nature could not avoid the emotional pain of such loss. In the 1940s, for example, the environmentalist Aldo Leopold lamented the ecological damage he witnessed and called for a new land ethic in response. His moment of epiphany came one day when he shot a female wolf, which was a common practice at the time, and he watched the fierce green fire dying in her eyes. The thinking in those days was that exterminating wolves would mean a larger and healthier population of deer for hunters. In that fateful encounter with the dying wolf, Leopold began to understand the greater ecological connection between the earth and all her creatures. His worldview abruptly changed, and As he called it, he began to think like a mountain. Ecological grief is very real, and though mostly unrecognized until recently, it has been with us for some time. One environmental philosopher, Glenn Albrecht, has even proposed a name for the condition: solastalgia. He describes solastalgia as the mental distress caused by environmental change, a kind of homesickness without leaving home. So what can be done about these overwhelming ecological crises and the grief and distress they are causing? This seems like an especially good question for a faith community such as ours that enshrines both social justice and respect for the interdependent web of all existence as part of our 7 principles. It would, of course, be impossible to offer a simple solution to the myriad ecological crises our planet is facing. But I think a response to our grief and distress is more immediately available. Furthermore, I believe that addressing these emotional and psychological crises may be critical to providing the needed solutions to climate change and other environmental problems. Psychologists, religious leaders, and environmentalists have created a variety of unique programs and practices to address ecological grief. But a common theme at the heart of these therapies is the idea that we must embrace our pain for the world. We need to be honest with ourselves about our deep feelings of grief. As Thich Nhat Hanh once said, what we most need to do is to hear within us the sounds of the earth crying. Like some therapeutic approaches to addiction, confronting ecological grief is often presented as a multi-step process that begins with acknowledging the reality of the pain and slowly proceeding through a series of steps to a more hopeful and accepting state of mind. One recent example is the Good Grief program created by Amy Rowe and Laura Schmidt. Good Grief is a 10-step program focused on collective grief that aims to quote, encourage participants to confront their climate fears and sadness and acknowledge that they are part of the problem as polluters in a carbon-fueled system, but also find the motivation and strength to be part of the solution. Another example, with which I'm more familiar, began in the late 1970s with Joanna Macy, John Seed, and a few other environmentalists, and it is known as the work that reconnects. For the last few decades, they have trained facilitators who have led workshops about reconnecting with the earth as a path to healing ourselves and our planet. Perhaps some of you have been fortunate to attend one. The workshops are grounded in the ideas of deep ecology, which considers human beings to be derivative of the earth, one among millions of species in a biological community, and the ideas of the emerging field of ecopsychology, which focuses on healing the broken relationship between the human psyche and nature. Macy is also a deeply spiritual Buddhist scholar, and this is apparent throughout her books and teachings. As she said of her approach to the ecological healing work, unless you have some roots in a spiritual practice that holds life sacred and encourages a joyful communion with all of your fellow beings, facing the enormous challenges ahead becomes nearly impossible. The work that reconnects workshops are designed as an imaginary spiral journey through 4 stages, with each stage leading to the next and each journey around the spiral leading to another. The 4 stages are coming from gratitude, honoring our pain for the world, seeing with new and ancient eyes, and going forth. For each stage, there are recommended exercises that are best conducted in a group setting because of the nurture and support that comes from sharing with one another. For more details, I would recommend reading the book Coming Back to Life, Practices to Reconnect Our Lives, Our World, by Joanna Macy and Molly Young Brown. But for now, let me provide a general overview. The first stage begins in gratitude. It is a time to become fully present and open for the work ahead. This opens us for the second stage, when we could share our pain for the world and experience the true meaning of compassion, to suffer with others. We begin to realize that we are not alone in the pain we feel. The rainforest activist John Seed describes this despair work as, quote, discovering that others aren't afraid of your pain for the world and witnessing theirs. Then you can dare to hope something for humanity and for what we can do together. When we unblock our despair, everything else follows: the respect and awe, the love, end quote. The reality of our inter-existence allows us to see with a new perspective, to see how truly connected we are to everything else in the universe, in the present, the past, and the future. We are encouraged to think of our relationship to so-called deep time, to think of ourselves both as descendants in a long evolutionary story and as ancestors subject to the demands of future generations. We may have a flash of insight, or it may come to us in a more gradual awakening, but we reach a turning point in our perceptions, or as Macy says more precisely, in the way we interpret our perceptions. Macy calls it a tantric flip, and it is no small turning point. She likens it to the Christian concept of metanoia, a profound transformation of the human psyche or soul. And it is good to have a solid spiritual framework of some sort to interpret such an experience. This reinvigorated, expanding perspective can begin to empower us to bring about change, knowing we are not alone and helpless, but connected to countless beings, offers both comfort and a wellspring of hope for the work ahead. We then go forth, using our time and talents in whatever way we can make a difference. This is the active hope of participation described in our reading. And even if we fail to achieve our goals, we can be grateful for making the attempt, and thus the spiral journey begins anew. Now I realize that not everyone is able to attend a workshop on the work that reconnects, or is even interested in doing so. I also realize that other social justice issues may be more important to some of you than climate change or other ecological crises. But let me suggest that the conceptual framework I described could be applied to almost any issue that makes you despair for the world. And it could work, at least in part, in just about any group setting. In a church community such as ours, I can think of many groups engaged with issues that can easily produce despair and frustration. We may live in a world that is beautiful and sacred, inspiring awe and wonder, but it is also a world filled with enough brokenness, hatred, and suffering to exhaust many lifetimes. Keeping our pain for the world internalized or trying to push it aside may work for a time, but it will likely overcome even the strongest among us in the end. Even an informal awareness of a practice like the work that reconnects can help us find the hope we need for the difficult work ahead. And it is difficult work indeed. As we celebrate another Earth Day this week, it is a time to recognize our connection to the earth with profound gratitude and joy. But we must also acknowledge that the world continues to warm from the relentless dumping of carbon into the atmosphere. Populations of animals are shrinking, with many species becoming extinct prematurely. And human beings are experiencing the impacts of climate change more than ever, though many of our neighbors continue to live in willful denial. Even so, we can find hope in the growing number of people who are waking up to the ecological crises and a changing political climate that should begin to correct the most egregious detrimental policies of recent years. The pandemic has also revealed that we can stop the madness of reckless consumption, at least for a time, if we are forced to face a new reality. And there are many other sources of hope we could name. When I honor my pain for the world, and I think about the enormous challenges ahead, I'm reminded of the Hebrew phrase tikkun olam, which you often encounter among Jewish social and environmental justice groups. It literally means repair of the world. The phrase is interpreted in a variety of ways by the different sects of Judaism, but most contemporary Jewish thinkers would describe it as living and acting with intention in a way that is beneficial for society and helps to end all forms of brokenness, injustice, and oppression. I've always liked this idea of tikkun olam because it acknowledges that the world is indeed in need of repair. And I think it implicitly calls us to recognize our pain for the world and choose to live in a way that makes a difference. Finding ways to do our small part to meet the challenge ahead is all we can really do, and it is enough. As individuals, we can turn active hope into action that can have impacts far greater than we can imagine. And as communities of like-minded, determined people, we can move mountains. So let us embrace our pain for the world and grieve as we should. But then, let us broaden our perspectives and embrace one another as partners in the work ahead. Tikkun olam, repair of the world, going forth in a spirit of gratitude and compassion. We will not only bring healing to the earth, but to ourselves as part of the earth. I invite you now to join in our closing hymn, number 1064, Blue Boat Home.
Still my drive.
Our closing words are the poem Sleeping in the Forest by Mary Oliver. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, a stone on the riverbed, nothing between me and the white fire of the stars but my thoughts, and they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. All night I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in the darkness. All night I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. By morning, I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better.
Please join us now for the extinguishing of our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.